couple now, and I thought that we would go ahead and cover them. We're going to start a little late. I apologize for that, but as we get back into the habit of doing this more often, I'll make sure that we start on time. So what we're going to talk about is on Wednesdays at Brentwood, we have been looking in the book of Revelation, and we've got a couple questions that come from the book of Revelation. And we've got one other question that actually is kind of related because it's a textual question about how do we understand the Bible. And so we're just going to dive right in. I don't know how long it's going to take, but we do have, I'm able to hopefully see and answer any questions that you might have or comments. If you've got ideas or insights, let me know what those are. Absolutely. And we'll just kind of start with our questions. So the first question we have, again, about the book of Revelation. And if you're watching, you may have questions about Revelation too. If they're not about the particular chapter that we're going to look at right now, please feel free to send them in. Always happy to talk about the book of Revelation. It's quickly becoming my favorite book. So in chapter 13, the question is, in our class, we suggested, or I suggested, that perhaps you're not seeing Nero here. You could be, right? To be completely fair, you could be. A lot of what you think is happening depends in part on when you date the book. If Revelation is written sometime before the destruction of Jerusalem, the book, it would have to be written like 64, 65, maybe even as late as around 67 AD. But you've got to have the 3.5 year period before the destruction of Jerusalem for some of the things in the book to make sense. If you think that it's written at a much later date, like 90 AD, so 25 year swing, those things become less important. But other things do become more important. For example, when you get here in Revelation chapter 13, if you are looking at a date of around 90 AD or so, it's much more likely perhaps that Nero is being referred to in chapter 13 and maybe a couple other places in the book. And to be fair, there are lots of the Roman emperors who are going to fit some of the details that you see here, because it seems perhaps, and maybe what was suggested on our class Wednesday, is it seems that we're not looking for a particular single person, an emperor, but the emperor, right? All of the things that the Roman emperor will do, all of the bad things, all of the persecution that is going to come from Rome, the stress, the pressure on Christians in the first century tied to things like the emperor worship, the worship of Rome itself, just Roman culture in general. The same thing is true with the second beast in chapter 13. It's a false Messiah, right? It looks like a lamb. It's got 2 horns like a lamb, but it speaks like a dragon. It's a false Messiah. And it is a false religion that is being proffered to the people in place of Christianity. And you see that throughout the New Testament, perhaps in the form of the Judaizing teachers who come and try and change some of the fundamental aspects of the gospel. They try and add things like circumcision. They try and draw people away from Jesus. You have Paul in Galatians chapter 1 saying things like, if anybody comes to you and preaches a different gospel, let them be anathema. So there certainly seems to be elements that's what this could be. And if you think the book is written after the destruction of Jerusalem, maybe you still would argue that second beast is some kind of false religion put forward by the Jews, or maybe you would just argue that it is indeed even their emperor worship. So a lot of the details depend on when you think the book is dated. I don't necessarily think that those details are specifically important to getting the message out of Revelation. So there's going to be a beast. It's going to come. It's going to look like the dragon. In chapter 13, you've got this beast that comes. It's got all these different parts that make it up. It's an amalgamation of the beasts in Daniel chapter 4. It is kind of representative of all the kingdoms of the world. And you certainly see that in the Roman Empire, right? They have all the kingdoms of the world kind of rolled up into it. It's the dominating force. But even if it didn't, it's still just all the kingdoms of the world, because there is one person guiding those, and that would be the dragon, right? This kingdom comes in the form of the dragon. And so it is the domain of darkness that is coming against the Christians, coming against our brothers and sisters in the first century, and even against us today. At different points in history, the dragon would be different people. It would be the British Empire at some point. It could very well be actually the United States. And so what you depending on your perspective, right? We would say, well, it's China or Russia or somebody else, but not us. It's actually, it's the world empires, the kingdoms of the world. And you see over in chapter 11 how the kingdoms of the world have become the kingdom of the Christ. Jesus wins. That's the message. So here, this horrendous beast coming with all the might and power and authority of the domain of darkness, it is ultimately going to be defeated. And so when we're reading through it, there are lots of very, very wise, very well-read, very highly educated people who do think that it's talking about Nero. So if that happens to be the conclusion you come to, that's fine. It may very well be. My point that I would make is that even if it is Nero, it's still not Nero. If that makes sense. It is who Nero is. And so when you go through, we looked at a couple of things, and this is the other thing, the other question. It was about this number of the man, and that's going to show up at the end of our chapter here. What is this number of the man? And this is why many people will come and they will say that this is Nero. And when they read through it, there are two numbers actually that show up, 666 and 616. You may or may not have ever heard that there are two numbers at the end of Revelation chapter 13, 666 and 616. And the reason why some people will argue, maybe correctly, that you get both of those numbers is Nero's name changes. Sometimes he's Nero, sometimes he's Neron, and the difference between those two is the difference between 616 and 666. If you do the gematria, where you have the numbers into letters and letters into numbers, that actually is pretty good evidence that it could be referring specifically to Nero here, and maybe him as a type of these just megalomaniacal, say that 10 times fast, world rulers who cause all kinds of trouble and heartache for Christians throughout time. It always seems like there is somebody in the world who is really powerful who causes trouble for Christians. And this is maybe a type of that person. So the question was, why are there two numbers, and is that a mistake? The answer is no. So let's just, for the sake of the argument, assume that this is Nero, and we're dealing with him. If you are in a place where Nero is referred to as the shorter name, Nero, then you might use the smaller number, 616. If you are in a place where Nero is known as longer name, Neron, then you might use the bigger number. And so you'll wind up with different texts based upon what Nero is called. That's actually really legitimate, and it lends a lot of credibility and a lot of weight to the idea that the person being discussed here, maybe the one who is wounded and comes back, is this myth or this idea that Nero is going to come back. Some people will say it's this the redivivus myth, where Nero was going to come back from the dead and rule the empire again. Or it could just be the emperors in general. Nero is killed, then there's 4 emperors right in a row. It looks like Rome is going to fall apart, but Vespasian comes and kind of resurrects the beast, so to speak. That fits. And so if it is referring to Nero, you might have this variation of 616 or 666, and it actually explains why you get that variation. And so here in the text, what we see is not a mistake, but the number changing based off of what Nero is called in different places. And so when you're reading through the Bible, just because there's a difference in some of the manuscripts, you kind of have to take a step back and say, why are those differences present? And do they matter? And first of all, do they change the text in any way? And if there is a change, like here, I mean, the two numbers are not the same. Why do those differences exist? If you're actually referring to two separate or to one person who goes by 2 different names, well, that's why you would have different numbers. And so it's one of those instances where a difference might actually be the most accurate thing, depending on where he's called what. So that's just kind of a recap of 2 of the questions that got asked about chapter 13. And please, if you have questions about the book of Revelation, feel free to send those to me, and we'll talk about them. You can post them under the videos. You can get in contact with me. You can email me. You can contact me on Facebook or Twitter or however you happen to be watching this. And especially if you disagree with something that I think or something that we're talking about, that's when we have the most fun. If you've got arguments for why you think the book is a later date rather than early date, we can do a video about that. We can talk about that also. So the next question is actually on a totally different track or totally different place in the text, but a very similar track. So if we look over in Joshua chapter 5, we've got this interesting story of how the people are going into the land and this new generation is going to be circumcised. So apparently the whole time, while Israel is wandering in the wilderness, none of the little boys that are being born along the way are being circumcised. And this last generation that God had said, you're going to spend 40 years in the wilderness and then you're all going to die. And then I'll take you into the promised land. Apparently, when that generation dies, then now there's no men in Israel, or none of the children born during that sojourning have been circumcised. And they're supposed to be on the 8th day after their birth. Well, you get here, and what you're actually going to see is an interesting picture. And it brings up the question, how do we understand the biblical text? And that's an important question with Revelation. What is John trying to tell you, and how do you understand the biblical text? In Revelation, are you looking for literal things, or actual events? Are we really supposed to think that a giant beast is going to come out of the land, and it's going to look like that amalgamation of things, and it's just going to be here and you can see it? Do we really expect a lamb that looks like a lamb but sounds like a dragon? Do we expect that to rise up out of the land and we have these two giant beasts going around doing things? Do we really expect to see the woman riding on this beast? Do we expect to actually see those things? The grasshoppers, the crazy grasshopper that you've got in the book of Revelation? Or is John giving you something else? Is he giving you signs and symbols? Well, he tells you that it's a book full of signs and symbols. And so when we get to places like Revelation 13 and Revelation 17, and you've got these pictures of these beasts and you're given all these different meanings, you don't necessarily have to find specific incidents. Now, the book is going to have a very specific fulfillment for the people to whom it is written, but in these images, they are meant to be understood in a way thematically. I don't live in the first century. And whenever these people got the book, whether it was before 70 AD or around 90 AD, whenever they get the book, there is something that is going to happen soon that the book is trying to inform them about so that they don't get caught off guard. Well, I don't live then. So the immediate reference, the immediate thing that is going to happen, that doesn't apply to me anymore. If it is the destruction of Jerusalem and the impending wave of persecution leading up to that and through that, I'm never going to go through that. I'm never going to experience it. If it is a decidedly and markedly intense Roman persecution against the church, I'm not going to go through that either. So what I have to do is look at that book thematically and say, okay, that was a specific fulfillment. Now, what is the theme? What is the message that is eternal, or that is, takes us to the end? And here in Joshua, we have the same question. There is a particular event that takes place, and you're supposed to get the history, right? Yes, it's actually true that the generation of people wandered around for 40 years, and none of the boys who were born during that time were circumcised. You're supposed to understand that, just straightforward history. And now, when they're coming to the land, it's going to be time to circumcise them. Hopefully, you're young enough that you won't remember. But this is an actual historical event. So on one level, that is the truth that you're supposed to get out of it. It really is just a straightforward history. They wandered around for 40 years. They've crossed the Jordan. They're coming into the land. And now it's time to circumcise all the boys because we're this new nation, right? And we are going to keep the covenant of the Lord. There's another level in which we need to recognize that God is operating, and it is on the thematic or the eternal level, in which there are these great principles that are being shown to us again and again throughout the book. And we see the New Testament writers doing this. They go back to places in the Old Testament, and Paul will quote from Deuteronomy about how you shall not muzzle the ox while it's treading out grain. And then he asks the question, is God really concerned about the ox, or is he asking that question? Does he say that for our benefit? And Paul's answer is, well, of course, for our benefit. You can see that over in 1 Corinthians 9. So what we are doing here, when we're reading through this, our question is, does God really want us to know this history? I mean, is that the important thing? It's not unimportant, right? We need to know what's going on. But is that the end goal here? Is Joshua written just so that we can look back and say, oh, cool, funny names, weird places, the history? Or is Joshua written to give us some lasting, eternal principle that still affects us today? I would argue that the text of Scripture is dripping with things that matter for us today. It is full of it. Yes, there is absolutely the historical narrative that God intends for his people throughout time to look and say, okay, this is exactly what happened. But in that narrative, God is showing us other things that still matter. And so when you get to the New Testament, there's this huge debate about circumcision. Do new believers have to be circumcised? When a Gentile is converted to Christ, does he have to be circumcised in order to be saved? This is the book of Galatians, right? It's all about this argument. And so Paul is going to argue decidedly no. No, you don't have to be circumcised to be saved, especially if you're a Gentile. If you're Jewish, it's probably a good idea because that's kind of your culture. It's who you are. He will take Timothy. Paul will take Timothy, who is half Jewish, and have him circumcised. He'll take Titus, who is not Jewish at all, and he will not circumcise him. And so the answer kind of, is this a wise thing to do? Is it depends. But is it required? Absolutely not. Otherwise, Titus would have to do it. And so when we come then to Joshua 5, Paul has already looked back in the letter to the Romans. He's gone back to Genesis, and he argues that the law was given, or Abraham is justified through faith before the law. In Genesis chapter 15 and verse 6, Abraham believed God. It's counted to him as righteousness. And so that's what's going on. We can turn over there real quick and just look at that. So Genesis chapter 15 and verse 6, you can see that here. Here's Abraham. He believed God. It's counted to him as righteousness. This is before the law, right? The law doesn't come until Exodus 19. That's when you start seeing the law given on Mount Sinai. And Moses kind of looks back and records these things for us. So Abraham is justified by his faith. He believed the Lord, counted to him as righteousness before circumcision, before the law. That's important. When you get over to Joshua chapter 5, here we see this theme appearing again. We've got these people who have been wandering around in the wilderness because they didn't listen. God takes them to the promised land in Numbers chapter 14. They don't want to go in. They leave. They want to go back to Egypt. They want to reject God and go back and have Pharaoh as their king, and they'll be slaves to Pharaoh. So God says, you're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years till all of you are dead. From the people who are 20 and older till all of you are dead, you're not going into the promised land. And now here we've got the people, the younger ones, who now they're coming into the land and they're going to be circumcised after they've come in. That's important, because what we see is it is not their adherence to the law that brought them across the Jordan, that brought them into the promised land, and even is going to cause them to be circumcised. It is actually their faith. And so it is the faith of the people who look and see, okay, we've got to do this. We have to go. We actually have to do what God said. It is their faith that allowed them to walk across the Jordan. It is their faith that brings them to this point. And so they likewise are justified by their faith. We see this picture. They are brought into the promised land by their faith before they are circumcised. Now, never could you argue, oh, they don't have to be circumcised. It's not important. Never could you argue that, right? It is in the law. Israel gets in trouble every time they don't obey the law. But what we see is God puts these pictures in place to help us remember it is not law keeping that justifies. Because if it were the works of the law, then it wouldn't be by grace, but it would be something that you earn. That's Paul's argument throughout the letter to the Romans. And so here in this picture in Joshua, what you see is God saying, hey, yes, this history, absolutely important. You need to know what's going on when and who and where and why, but you also need to understand that I'm showing you something that is bigger than this little moment in history. I'm showing you how people are justified from Abraham to Joshua to everybody in the New Testament, right? We are justified through faith. That it's the faith that takes us, for Christians today, the faith that takes us to the water is the faith that justifies. The faith that caused these people to go make flint rocks and begin circumcising the men, that is the faith that justifies. And so what we see is, that's kind of all throughout the text of Scripture. Jesus will even say things like, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And so here we see that exact same thing. These people, they love the Lord. They want to be faithful. They're excited. They're going in. They've crossed the Jordan. They are going to go conquer the land. But before they do that, they're going to make sure that they're doing everything they need to do. And in fact, when you continue down, they're actually going to celebrate the Passover now, right? So, they're doing everything, right? They're going to circumcise all the men. They're going to start celebrating the Passover. They're going to keep the law. It's not the law keeping that gets them across the river. It's their faith. And that's important. And so as we kind of go back and look throughout the text of Scripture in all these different places, there are layers in which we might understand the Bible. Sometimes there are very specific events that are being talked about, like the persecution in the first century with the book of Revelation. And once you get past those events, now there is this theme that is present, this prophetic image that kind of rolls forward throughout time, in which the book of Revelation still applies to me today, but not because I'm being persecuted by Rome, but because I am still being attacked by the domain of darkness. Satan is still at work. I'm still fighting this spiritual battle. When we come to Joshua and we see this moment in time where they've crossed the river, they're circumcising the men, they're keeping the Passover, they're doing all of these amazing things, we should know those details because those details are necessary to see the bigger picture. that you are justified through faith, that Paul will argue quite eloquently in the book of Romans and the letter to the Galatians and all sorts of various places throughout the text of the New Testament. It's absolutely a biblical idea. It definitely does not mean you don't have to obey. But what it does mean is that it is the faith that causes us to obey. That is the faith that justifies. It's not just, okay, yeah, I kind of think God is real, but now I'm going to go live my life the way that I want to. That's not a justifying faith. The justifying faith is the faith that leads us to the water, so to speak. Right? So maybe a way we could say it that might help us understand it, because the modern kind of parallel, loosely, to circumcision would be baptism in the New Testament. You can see that in Colossians chapter 2, how Paul kind of compares circumcision to baptism. He's going to say, circumcise your hearts. And then he talks about how we are baptized with Christ. And then he says, let's just turn over there. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 12. This is important. Having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith. Right? You are raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God who raised Jesus from the dead. So it is your faith in baptism that makes baptism a thing. The faith that leads us to the water is the faith that works in the water. So that's how we are justified by faith. If somebody says, oh yeah, I believe, I'm faithful, I'm justified by faith, but I'm not doing this thing that God says, that's not faith, right? So could you imagine the Hebrews crossing the Jordan River and God says, all right, it's time to circumcise the men. And they're like, oh yeah, God, we believe you. We think that's in the law, but we're not going to do it. No, right? And so that's what we're seeing in the New Testament. This faith, the faith that leads to the water is the faith that justifies in the water. It is the same faith that justifies out of the water. It is justification through faith. All right? It begins and it ends in this great faith. Paul argues that in Romans chapter 1. So that's kind of how we can use the Bible in a variety of different ways. The details are important. The stories are important because it is the details and the stories that give us these great pictures. All right? So those are the questions that we had. Again, if you've got questions or comments, please feel free always to leave them. I enjoy doing this. I love getting to talk with people about the Bible. I enjoy it when people ask questions I don't know the answers to, so we have to dive into the text together. I always like to hear what other people have to think, so please feel free to join us and join the discussion and bring different viewpoints. Bring ideas that are contrary to the ones presented, and we'll work through them together, because it is a blessing always to study with people who are diligently and faithfully trying to serve the Lord, and with people who are coming to faith in God. All right. I love you guys. It's a blessing to be part of the family at Brentwood. It's a blessing to be here with you. If you're joining us and visiting with us, God bless you all.